Hello and welcome to the Methodist Podcast, published on the 2nd of July 2020. This week we talk with the new President and Vice President of the Methodist Conference. We discuss race and the Methodist Church. We get advice on how to reopen churches for worship, and we hear from some of those who've been received into full connection about what the experience meant for them.
The conference has formally affirmed its decision of last year to elect the Reverend Richard Teal and Mrs. Caroline Lawrence, respectively, to the offices of President and Vice President. We now proceed to induct them, this year, as we have heard, in separate ceremonies out of the necessity brought upon us by the current pandemic.
That was the Reverend Dr. Jonathan Hustler, Secretary of the Methodist Conference, announcing the formal vote on Saturday for the new President and Vice President. Of course, their induction, like the rest of the conference, was live-streamed from Cliff College in Derbyshire with social distancing in place. Joining me on the line now is the new President of the Methodist Conference, Richard Teal. Hello, Richard. I imagine the conference was very different from the one you were expecting.
It's been totally different, Mike, to the normal conference when there's hundreds of people milling about, and there's lots of life and vigour and laughter and people meeting and creating fellowship and meeting new friends and just the hubbub of a crowd. Here is very different. We're at Cliff College, so we're right out in the country, outside of a village even, with beautiful grounds, but just a few people about, literally a few people about. And where conference is coming from, as it were, where we are chairing it from, there's literally just half a dozen people in the room. So you can maybe imagine half a dozen people compared to 300 odd in the hall. It's a very different feel, and we're surrounded by cameras and TV screens, and we don't know who's out there. Apart from when somebody's speaking, we see their particular face and where they're speaking from. But that's it. Apart from that, we are speaking into cameras. So it's a very, very different experience. And, for the presidential address, and on Sunday morning, I preached the service in Westminster Central Hall. I was preaching at a camera rather than a church full of people with all the atmosphere that creates. It's very, very different. But I think we're doing okay. And I'm getting some really positive feedback from how conference is going. And we're surrounded by a fantastic technical team, just tremendous, who are helping us every step of the way. They're fantastic.
And of course, your inauguration was very different as well, wasn't it?
Well, it certainly was. I mean, going back a year, I was anticipating the big crowds at the induction of the new president and vice president. We were allowed to bring 100 guests of family and friends. We had all the list prepared who was going to be invited. And then all of a sudden, naturally and rightly, everything had to change to what it's become today. So family and friends could watch it on Zoom. And I know that many of them did. But it's not the same, just being inducted with half a dozen people around you, even though everybody's watching through a visual means, a virtual means. So it was very, very different type of thing. And to be quite honest with you, I went through a few months ago quite a low mood about that and about other things that traditionally happen for the president and the vice president, things that would never happen at any other time in your life. But I had to come to terms with, I'm a servant of the church, and we are in very different times, and what was happening for me is happening to everybody else as well. So it's a very different experience to what we envisaged.
And how about your year in office? I imagine the plans for that have had to change too.
The presidential year, by March, on the whole, had all been planned. It was a year of lots and lots of visits. And my particular speciality is in rural mission and rural ministry. And that's what I've been elected upon last year. And so at this time of year, I should have been going to the Royal Show in Yorkshire, the Royal Show in Wales, the Royal Show in Cornwall, preaching at those things. mixing with people in the agricultural world in those areas. And of course, they were the first to be cancelled. And so it goes on. So you ask, what's the year going to be like? It's going to be a very, very different year. And it was all planned. I knew exactly what I was doing from today, as it were, until next July. I can't say that now, naturally and rightly. And it's going to be, I think, an evolving kind of ministry this year, and a very different sort of ministry to what I anticipated. I think it's going to be very pastoral. It's going to be very supportive. It's going to be very encouraging. As we look at new ways of being church, and as we come out of this lockdown eventually, where that will eventually lead us. And I think it's too early to say just where the church will be in 12 months' time. People are saying all sorts of things, but I think it's just too early to know. So I think that low mood I had, you can understand why I had it. I've now come round that this year could really be hugely, hugely exciting, but very different.
Although things have been different this year, I'm sure there will still be parts that are going to be memorable. What will have been the highlights of this year's conference for you?
Well, so far, I think I would have to say, obviously, and I'm not full of pride in saying this, but my own induction was a most moving, intimate induction. And Barbara Glasson, the ex-president, inducted me into the office. And it was hugely meaningful. I think the same day we had the reception for the ordinands, reception to full connection. And I hope for the ordinands, it was a really good experience, because again, for them, a very, very different experience. What they would have been looking forward to and really looking forward to and enjoying had to be done in their own homes. The lovely thing was we could see them in their own homes, and they could all respond in their own homes. And I hope for them, it certainly was for me, a very, very moving experience when they were answering personally, could see them personally, not just as a corporate body. That was another highlight. And I also think, and it might sound hard to say, but there is just a few of us working here and being here, and the fellowship between us, along with the technical staff, is really rich. It's really rich and really, really supportive. And I think maybe finally, and again, it's going back to the digital world, is the number of people who've come to me and commented on the address I gave, and just wishing me well and offering prayers. And whilst we're in a studio surrounded by screens, etc., there is this wave of prayer going on throughout the whole of Methodism, and not just Methodism in this country, but worldwide Methodism as well. And that was seen in the reception of the church leaders from around the world and our ecumenical partners too.
On Saturday, Carolyn Lawrence was inducted as the Vice President of the Methodist Conference, and she joins me on the line. I have to say, Carolyn, for those that were watching at home, the live stream has been very slick. Is everyone happy with how things have gone?
People have said that it's coming over quite smoothly, which is great because they're not seeing the sort of paddling furiously under the water behind the scenes. So I'm glad that's coming over like that. But it's mainly thanks to this amazing technical team that we've got, because they're just keeping everything smoothly going. And Paul Wood is doing an amazing job of holding us all together and keeping us on the right track. So it's great that it's coming over so smoothly to people that are participating and viewing.
You were inducted as the Vice President of the Methodist Conference on Saturday. How does the presidentship work?
Yeah, so every year the Methodist Church appoint a president who's an ordained presbyter, and then they appoint a vice president who's either a layperson or a deacon. So I was elected last year to this role, or designated last year and elected on Saturday. So basically we're kind of part of the leadership team, and we visit the districts during the year and engage with the churches around the connection and the global church, so that we can hear what's going on, hear people's hearts, and find out what, people's thoughts across the connection, and hopefully feed that back into the leadership and participate in that. So I think for me as a layperson, it's great to have that connection with the ordinary people in the pew and the leadership. It's great to feel that I'm in that kind of bridge between.
Each year the President and Vice President choose a theme together. What's yours going to be?
Yeah, so our title is "The Best of All is God is with us," which was some of Wesley's last words. And so what we're looking at really over the year is growth, and we're looking at, for me particularly, looking at I want to look at personal growth in discipleship and corporate growth as churches. And obviously the circumstances of that have changed because of COVID-19, but the principles are the same. And I recently went on a World Church trip to Brazil just before lockdown, and some of the principles of church growth there, because their church is growing amazingly, are some of the principles that I want to really help to bring to the church in Britain, because I think some of them can be applied to our churches here, and hopefully can help us to see how we can grow the church as well with God's help.
When you gave your inaugural address to the Methodist Conference, you shared some of the challenges that the church faces. What would you like to see happen during your year?
Yeah, I mean, I shared some of the stories of some of the things that are not so good about the church, and things that people have said to me about their experiences, and also my own experience in various parts of the church. But I do, as I said in the speech, I do believe that the church is amazing, and that God has ordained a church to represent him on the earth, and we're here with Jesus as our head, to be his hands and feet in this world, and to bring his kingdom into this world. So I just really hope that as I go around, hopefully if I get to speak to people, I want to talk about church growth and things that hinder our growth in the church. And some of those bad things are the things that hinder us from reaching out to people with the love of Jesus. So hopefully want to talk about how we can grow personally and use our own gifts to extend God's kingdom, and how we can corporately use our gifts together to shine the light of Jesus into our communities and into our world.
The Methodist Conference has voted to bolster and increase its work on equality, diversity and inclusion throughout the connection. Anthony Brotang is a preacher at Methodist Central Hall in Westminster and was one of the representatives who spoke to a notice of motion regarding Black Lives Matter, and he joins me now. Hello, Anthony.
Hi, Michael.
Anthony, you spoke passionately to the Methodist Conference about race and the life of the church. What moved you to make that presentation?
I was moved to make that presentation because, for me, this issue is very personal. And it's one that you can't run away from. And it's very personal because, for me, I've experienced, segregation and racism for most of the time that I've been in this country. From my experience of racism goes back to, being told to go back to my own country, even though all my parents are British. I spent, most of my time in this country since around the age of 12. And also being treated very harshly in the workplace, being called monkey and all sorts of names. The experience is catalogued. I can name so many times when I've experienced it. So I think it just came really from the heart and very personal.
And how have you seen racism manifest itself in the life of the church?
I think in the life of the church, I've experienced it in many different ways, whether personally or indirectly. And I think for me, that racism exists in the church in terms of the structure in which we currently have in place. And also the culture that we also have in place is also a contributing factor. And I think we also have this elite mentality that goes on as well. And our theology, I think, is also a factor. I think people are not really being allowed to really truly be themselves. And we have this almost kind of like system that we have where Black people are not really able to rise up in the system. We almost, if I can use the analogy, we invite Black people to the dinner party, but once they come to the dinner, then they're told to serve the meal while, our counterparts are sat down enjoying the meal. And I think that is not right. I think that the issue can be tackled in many different ways. And, I don't want to be too prescriptive because I'm sure I don't have all the answers to that. But if I could just name a few, I mean, I personally think we first need to, to deal with the race problem, separately from the this whole inclusivity issue, because I think this is a very difficult issue. This is a very big issue, which requires a lot of resources. When we had things like the past abuse case issues, or these were issues that were tackled differently, all individually on their own rights. And I think we have to do the same thing with the race issue. I think we also need to have a proper committee to address it. And by that, I mean, we need to have people who really understand, these issues. We need to have people who have been through the issues and have the passion and the time and the resources really to deal with it. And we also need clear goals. We need, strategy. We need implementations. We need time scale, and it needs to be reported back to the appropriate committees as well. And I think, of course, EDI can play a role in that. I see no reason why not. I think the Methodist Council can also play a role in that. I don't see why not as well. But I think, Black people need to be allowed to be able to tell up their own stories. There's nothing worse than, dealing with these kind of issues. And you've got some of our white counterparts who may have been to maybe Ghana or Caribbean for a year or maybe a few weeks and so forth, and begin to articulate what they think the issues really are, because it's not the same.
Stephen Hetherington is the Director of Property Support at the Methodist Church, and it's been his job to interpret the government's rules and regulations on how we return to worship. And he joins me on the line now. Hello, Stephen.
Hi, nice to meet you. Thank you.
Stephen, churches don't have to open if they don't feel confident in doing so, do they? What should churches consider when they're making that decision?
I think the first thing to say actually is, and I think most people will have experienced this, is I think it's fair to say lockdown was always going to be a lot easier than coming out of lockdown. In a way, I think for us as a team ourselves and writing the guidance for it was a lot easier when you simply have to write, you just can't do this anymore. That's it, full stop, And actually, therefore, I think coming out of lockdown, it's incredibly difficult for everyone. And therefore, really, what we've tried to do with the guidance is take people through step by step and actually sort of try and put some sort of fairly, we hope anyway, logical process to how you approach it. So that's why on our guidance, we produced this sort of cycle, this sort of little diagram that we've done that sort of takes people through it step by step. And again, it's more, and again, I think we've emphasized it a little bit in the guidance as well. Don't see it as a linear process. It's not something that actually has a beginning and end. It's something which actually may go round and round for quite some time, because as you develop stuff and you test it out, that may not quite work. And therefore it's really important that churches and managing trustees continually review things. And dare I say it, may actually at some point say this isn't working and actually we need to close again. And I think that's a reasonable decision actually. And I think in the guidance, again, we've tried to emphasize that a little bit, is don't feel obliged. Really don't feel any pressure on yourselves to reopen. But really the first thing to think about, which has actually come from colleagues within the evangelism and growth team, really, and the mission teams, is actually think missionally. Actually think about what lockdown has been like, and what have you learned from it? What have been the good things? What have been the bad things? And actually not so much look to the past, but look to the future. And actually, before you reopen your churches, think missionally. That's really, really important, is actually think about why you're wanting to reopen your church, and what you want to achieve from it. And I think that's a really important thing to do. And then dare I say, that's saying the more creative bit a little bit. And then the rest of it then following on is very much a more practical approach. So they're really the things about planning thoroughly, consulting with people widely, and that will be very different for different churches, of course. There could be churches, managing trustees who just have a chapel, and that's simply the purpose of the church is for a place of worship and meeting. But then there's others, of course, that have larger complexes of buildings, and they have a lot more to think about, and have a lot more different people and parties and community groups and so on and so forth, preschools and all these other things. Then it's really important that they're all included in these conversations and these discussions about what the risks are, and what they want to get from it. At the end of the day, everyone wants to get back to normal. I mean, that's the reality of it. We all want to get back to normal, but sadly, I don't think that will come just yet.
Are these government guidelines law? Will churches get into trouble if they get things wrong?
It's a really good question, that actually. The government themselves, I think, have put in a mixture of approaches in the guidance. I think there's elements of it, which I'll mention in a minute, but there's elements of it which are very much enshrined in law. And then there's other parts which are saying, you could do this, you could do that. Again, it's very difficult. And, we found it incredibly difficult writing guidance to try and cover every single eventuality. And I know, hand on heart, we won't have covered everything. Because each local situation is going to have some slightly different nuances, as it were, to their building, their property, and the makeup of their congregation, and so on. So in terms of what the government's expecting legally, the only thing that we've really pulled out is they seem to be enshrining in law. So they're saying you have to do this, is the risk assessment, which I appreciate is probably the last thing anyone wants to do. Because it's quite laborious. You do have to do it quite methodically, and it takes a lot of discussion. And actually, I fully appreciate, I think a lot of people aren't used to these sorts of things. So don't feel you have to do it all yourselves. We have suggested if you have the right skills within certain members of the congregation, to do that, that's wonderful. Just to go back to your original question, really at the moment, we can only really see risk assessments being the actual legal responsibility of the trustees as dictated by the government guidance. Everything else beyond that, as we see at the moment, is a case of, these are things that we would recommend you do. I would also say, I suppose, in the background to it, of course, in anything that we've written and some of what the government's written around specific guidance for churches, it's all rooted in that very core sort of general guidance for the population, as in minimum distances, social distancing, certain restrictions on numbers, and so on and so forth. So there are a number of other specific frameworks, if you like, specific numbers that they're quoting. So we all know, it used to be 2 meters distancing. For specific services now, I think that's been reported widely in the media as well. There's 30 people allowed to a wedding. 30 people to a baptism if you don't have it as part of a service. So again, they're very specific numbers, and I would suggest, I'll be honest, I'm not sure if it's actually enshrined in law, but I would suggest that the government have made it very clear it's a very specific number, and therefore churches should be sticking to that number. The only thing where they haven't done is actually in church services themselves. I think, as I was aware in the early conversations that we had within the government, there was a talk of a cap, but then that didn't materialise. And what they did accept was some churches are bigger than others. And therefore, it would make sense to leave that with the responsibility for, in our case, with managing trustees, to say, well, we have quite a significantly large church here. It seats, 700 people. Therefore, we can very easily accommodate X number rather than saying it's just 30. So again, that's something where the risk assessment will be an absolutely crucial piece of work, really, to undertake that.
There's an awful lot of information for people to take in, and I'm sure we can't possibly cover all eventualities. Where should people go if they require further advice?
Right, well, the guidance itself is in 2 places, actually. So in terms of the property guidance, it's on the property pages of the Methodist Church website. And again, obviously, we can provide some links to that if people are interested. And then really, I know we won't have covered everything. There will be very specific questions that people will have. So the easiest thing is to contact us within the property team. So the email for that is property@methodistchurch.org.uk. And that will go through to myself and my colleague Leslie. So the 2 of us are working together on this. And we aim to try and get back to people as soon as possible. We are a little bit under pressure at the moment, so we may not respond. We've normally tried to turn around responses within about 48 hours in normal times. But if people can bear with us a little bit, it might be a tiny bit longer at the moment, just because of the number of queries we might be getting. But that would be the first place to start. What we will do, of course, is we've got colleagues at TMCP, and they're providing some brilliant guidance as well. And we We actually have weekly meetings. So again, we're working together with that. We meet with other colleagues as well with other members of the connectional team. So that's really important. So if we can't answer the question and we don't think it's necessarily within our remit to answer it, then we will also signpost people or pass their email on to who we think is the relevant person. So again, don't think it'll just sit in the inbox if we can't answer it. We will pass it on to someone else if needs be.
With a very different conference taking place this year, the ordinands were received into Full Connection online, and here are just 3 of them with their reflections of the experience.
My name's John Malnut, and I'm stationed in the Mid-Derbyshire circuit. Reception into Full Connection for me on Saturday was a really moving and special moment, actually. It was great that I was able to set my screen up so I could see what was being broadcast out, but I could also see all of my colleagues and fellow ordinands in gallery view on Zoom as well. So it was really special to be able to see everyone preparing to make that commitment to the church all together. And I didn't expect to find it as overwhelming as I did, but certainly having a lot of messages coming into me kind of during that time, hearing family who wouldn't ordinarily be involved in church, let alone conference, business and proceedings, seeing that they were watching it and just having all those messages coming from across the circuit in connection was really special. And it felt like a real connectional moment because there were so many people sort of saying things, and all the chat that kind of happened online following it as well made it really special. I didn't expect to be as overwhelmed by it as I was, but it really was a special moment to mark the end of the probation section of my ministry.
Hello, I am Esther Akam, stationed in the London Mission Northwest Circuit. I work with Gospel Oak Methodist Church and Kensington Methodist Church. The reception into Full Connection experience, the emotions and the relevance of it all took me by surprise. Obviously, we've not been here before, so we didn't really know what to expect. But the most moving part for me of that service was having people that support me and supported me on that day and not being able to see them. I knew I had their support and I felt it. So as I made my vow or responded to the vows, it felt real. I could feel them. It almost, on reflection, feels like knowing that I have the support of God and I know He loves me, but I don't see Him and I know He is there. So I knew they were there. Although I was there on my own, I knew they were there. And especially my mom and dad from Nigeria, watching from Nigeria and hearing about how they enjoyed it and laughed and cheered me on. That really touched me. And it made it personal for me.
Hello, my name's Ben Scrivens. I'm a Methodist ordinand in the Barnsley circuit, working in the Northwest Church, which is a multi-site church, so several chapels. The best thing about this for me was actually the reception to Full Connection lasted about 50 minutes in total. And because it's been separated from the ordination by quite a long way, it's given me the opportunity to have conversations with friends and family about the uniqueness of what reception into Full Connection is, rather than it all just getting lumped into a big day that is all about ordination. And it was really special for me as a single man to be able to bubble with my best friend who I've journeyed through faith and calling with for many, many years, since we were children, in fact. To be able to bubble with him and go and celebrate with him at his house, reception into Full Connection. He was received into Full Connection too. He was upstairs, I was downstairs on separate laptops. And it was really special to me to be sat at his dining room table, which was piled high with new baby clothes and, washing that needed to be done and paperwork and whatever else that was just scattered around, to be in the mess of life, because for me, that's where my ministry, my calling really seems to be, is to be in and amongst just the chaos of the world, really. And sometimes our big celebration services to those looking in can just look a little bit too polished, a little bit too perfect. To be sat there was just spectacular. And it was really, really affirming to be sat there and then to have so many messages come in from people all around the globe that I've known and met.
This week's prayer is from the President of the Methodist Conference, the Reverend Richard Teal.
Gracious God, many of us feel like your people of the past, in exile. Teach us all to sing a new song where we can celebrate your absolute faithfulness to humanity and your created order come what may. May this reorientation to new life be found in the cross and resurrection of your Son and the power of your Holy Spirit. Summon us to the life, vision and values of your kingdom, and may we be strengthened to flourish and given confidence to play our part in the new life that you are constantly bringing into being. For the best of all is, God is with us. Amen.
Thank you for listening to this week's Methodist Podcast. If you've got any stories that you'd like us to cover, do get in touch. From myself, Mike Ivat, goodbye.